Welcome back. This is Dr. Pedram Shojai, the Urban Monk, here again hosting this wonderful experience called Interconnected. I had the privilege of being in the room with all the healthcare professionals and patients you've been hearing from, and this groundbreaking information can save your life. We ask that you share it far and wide. It takes around 15 years for new medical breakthroughs to reach most doctors' offices. That means whatever health issues your 8-year-old daughter is having, your family doctor may not offer the latest treatment until she's a full-grown adult. We simply can't wait for the slow-turning wheel of medicine to catch up to the science. In our first segment, we're going to talk about the microbiome's role in the detection, prevention, and possible treatment of cancer. This is revolutionary stuff and is rocking the foundations of medicine. See for yourself.
Back in the late 2000s, people started to ask the question, I wonder if we can find bacterial DNA in normal tissues, because we were at this time seeing huge correlations between what is the microbiome in the gut and what is the cancer that patient ends up with. And that, for a former chemotherapy researcher, was very hard to swallow, that cancer could somehow be predicted by which microbiome were in the gut, and you could figure out if they were going to have breast cancer or not. That just didn't make any sense with the model that we still have to this day of cancer. And so around that, 2007 and 2010 time was an exciting time where technology was starting to allow us to ask the question and get some answers, and the bulk of these disease epidemics was demanding that the questions be asked is, have we done something to the greater environment to suddenly cause all of these seemingly disparate disease processes all go epidemic at once? And so as we started to untease the microbiome question, we started to find that if you biopsy normal tissue, you find bacteria in there. If you biopsy cancer tissue, you see different bacteria in there. And so that was a big, big shift. One of the recent ones that got published about 2014 showed that healthy breast tissue has bacteria that's enriched in it called Sphingomonas. It's a cousin to Pseudomonas, which we see as kind of a dangerous pathogen in the hospitals. So to find out that Sphingomonas actually lives in the healthy breast of women was a little bit jaw-dropping. They then biopsied the other breast that had cancer in it, and they found that there was almost no Sphingomonas in it, but there was this methylobacterium there, a totally different species, enriched within the tumor tissue. This started to ask the question, I wonder if cancer is actually an infectious disease. I wonder if the wrong bacteria moves into the breast, starts to cause a dissolution of the function of the tissue or something, and starts to cause cancer. These benign cancers that never really grow were rich in methylobacterium. The aggressive cancers that would kill the woman and go metastatic, everything else, these had no bacteria left in them. And so a stunning realization of the human body should be an organic garden. And as we kill it through our environment, through our medical interventions, we get more and more sterile, it starts to lose its identity as human as it gets isolated. And we definitely see this on the macro level. One of the most potent punishments that's ever been come up with in the history of humanity is isolation. So we do these prison cells that we isolate prisoners, and they go through sensory deprivation. And everybody, no matter how intelligent, no matter how damaged, no matter how intact, will start to hallucinate by day 3 of isolation. And so this is very much what happens to a cancer cell. Put it in isolation. You put that into any cell in the body into solitary confinement, and it has no ecosystem, no garden around it, it's going to turn into cancer.
What I find really intriguing is the idea that there have been some reports now that some of these microbes in various tissues are associated with various diseases or specific cancers. I think we have to be careful because we're still in a phase of the research where what's been reported represent associations, and we haven't yet been able to show cause and effect. However, that possibility absolutely exists. And if that is true, and I'm not going to go so far as to say it will be true in all instances of breast cancer or pancreatic cancer, but if it is true in some, then what that may potentially provide us is a completely new set of targets to begin to think about treating some of these diseases.
I have a lot of patients that have the BRCA gene, the breast cancer gene, that are BRCA positive, but they haven't yet developed a cancer. And what the conventional approach is that in women that have completed their families, that they recommend that the ovaries come out, and they recommend mastectomy whenever the patient decides that they want to have that often significant reduction of breast cancer risk. So patients come to me because they want to know, what else can I do other than surgery? And straight off the bat, I want to say that it's not that I'm opposed to the surgery. I think the surgery is a great thing for someone that wants a significant risk reduction and actually can embrace and feels good about having the surgery. And then at the same time, I'm a resource for those patients that have already decided themselves that they don't want to have the surgery and want to know what else can they do. In addition, as an OBGYN, I'm usually the primary care provider for my patients. So I'm the one that notices that they've got this strong family history, and I'm the one that does the initial BRCA testing. So I can think of one patient, her name is Kathy, and she came in for a routine annual exam, new patient exam, and part of that evaluation is a family history. I found out that she had a mother and aunt, both with breast cancer, under age 50, and she was Ashkenazi Jewish, which put her at risk for having this breast cancer gene. She really didn't want to have testing done, and I told her that I was okay with whatever she did, but just realize that sitting here right now in my office, you either have the gene or you don't. So that's already determined. So if this gene is already in your body, why not know about it so we can start to do things so that we can reduce the chances that it will express itself? And that was the argument that swayed her. And so we did the test, and unfortunately it came back positive. And she had, 2 young kids at home, 16, 12, and she really said, I have to be alive for my kids. And she really wanted the surgery. However, she also wanted to do things in addition to the surgery. And so the first thing we did was gut health. We found the foods that she was sensitive to, so the foods that she shouldn't be eating, and we really did only one thing at a time from a functional perspective because so much was going on with the surgeries. So we picked that one intervention, and then all of a sudden she said, I'm a little less anxious because she had a little bit of a baseline anxiety issue, and I haven't gotten any migraines ever since I stopped having dairy and gluten, which she was coincidentally sensitive to. And so right away, I said, that's great, and you know that by decreasing the inflammation in your body from the gluten and the dairy, you're also helping yourself in terms of reducing the likelihood that this BRCA gene will turn into a breast cancer.
The current model that I think we have to really start to come to terms with as medical scientists is that it's no longer the understanding that it was a genetic injury that led to all this proliferative behavior because we turned on the wrong genes and we turned off the genes that would have protected us from it. That's happening, but to give you a sense of how damaged these cancer cells are, we do this in our own clinic. So we'll get a cancer patient with a weird cancer that's not behaving like we expect with treatment, and we can actually put that into culture and grow it up, and we can then do genomics on that tumor cell. At that point, the cell is so damaged it can't repair. And the more I've learned in the last 7 years of starting to understand cancer in the context of the microbiome, I'm starting to realize these cancer cells are simply just so damaged, and they're so isolated, that they've come to do the only thing they can do. They think they're the only thing left of life. They have completely forgotten they were part of a larger organism. So this is the dream of their own that they start to dream of, I can't repair anymore. And the only thing I've got left, the only option is to divide. And so these cells start to go into cell division very quickly. And that's the biochemistry or the cell biology of cancer, is rapid cell division. With every division, they're passing on all the damaged genetic information, and so none of those progeny can repair themselves either.
If I had a BRCA gene, right? If a woman had a BRCA gene, how could you use the microbiome's ecosystem to help it not express? Like, do we understand this well enough to know how well they work? I mean, it feels like we don't, so we just hack out the parts.
The question about whether we can use our understanding of the microbiome to affect gene expression of a gene like BRCA is really where the rubber's meeting the road right now. And this is really so exciting. So we know with BRCA, for example, that in patients that are BRCA positive, they don't metabolize or digest estrogen in a healthy way, that they are more likely to produce estrogens that can destroy DNA in the breast, for example. When we look at the microbiome, we know that the microbiome determines, or is one determinant, of the way we excrete or digest or metabolize estrogen. So a BRCA patient who is predisposed to metabolizing estrogen in a healthy way can either be hurt by her microbiome if her bugs are continuing to facilitate an unhealthy estrogen metabolism, or she can be helped by her microbiome if her microbiome is structured such that it can be beneficial with estrogen metabolism. And that's my role, to understand the science in both of these areas, and then to know what I need to do to help the microbiome so that her estrogen metabolism is made it to be as healthy as possible. That's really the juice in what I do right now, and that's why I love being here to talk about this topic, because really, just in summary here about the microbiome, the way we can tweak it is not only by avoiding foods that we're sensitive to, it's eating foods that are high in prebiotics rather. So it's about what we feed our bacteria, I think might ultimately be more important than the actual bacteria that are there, but that has yet to be proven. So the food that we feed our bacteria clearly is the same food that we feed ourselves. And so prebiotics, which are primarily fiber, and then foods that have fermentation associated with them, like kombucha or sauerkraut, those, kimchi, those fermented foods are also very good. And that helps feed and therefore sustain the right bacteria. Then you do a microbiome analysis and you see what's there or what's not there, and you give probiotics to make sure that you are giving the right strand of bacteria, the right type of bacteria. Then you feed the bacteria properly, and that, I think, is really where all health is going.
And, we've got oncologists that are telling people, don't eat blueberries. Don't eat blueberries because blueberries have antioxidants and that's going to interfere with the chemotherapy. That's nonsense. If you don't make the person stronger, then how are they ever going to fight this thing? So it's a combination. Yeah, you've got to go after the bad guys, the bad cancer, but you got to make the person strong at the same time.
So people often ask me why I don't recommend that they eat any sugar if they have cancer. And the answer is a simple one. Cancer cells love sugar. We know this because oncologists use a test called a PET scan to find active tumor in the body. And they want to find tumor that's a small enough volume that you can't see it on a CAT scan and you can't see it on an MRI. So what do? They order a PET scan. A PET scan leads to the injection of radioisotope glucose, or radio-labeled sugar, because they know that right after they inject the sugar into your bloodstream, it goes straight to the tumor. And so then they put you through the scanner and they see where that radio-labeled sugar went. So even the doctors know that sugar goes straight to cancer, but that doesn't translate into a recommendation to avoid sugar. Sugar also happens to be horrible for your microbiome. The bacteria that eat sugar are the ones that cause inflammation both locally in your intestinal tract and systemically through the rest of your body. So sugar feeds not only cancer cells, but the horrible bacteria in your gut. So stay away from sugar.
Have you seen any positive signal on cancer cells kind of joining back with the tribe when given the right milieu?
Cancer is actually the weakest, most lonely cell in your body. And out of that, we've built a $450 billion a year medical intervention called chemotherapy, surgery, radiation. That has nothing to do with getting that cell back into awareness of its greater environment. We could equate this back to like the solitary confinement that we do to prisoners, but we also do this to our psych wards. And so when somebody goes psychotic, we tend to put them in an isolation chamber, put them in a straitjacket, or put them in a padded room, and they beat the crap out of themselves for a few days, where really what would be ideal is surround that person with so much love and nurture that they have no choice to get connected to the larger organism again. And we do the same thing to our cancer patients. We put them in hospital rooms that have now been sterilized from any microbiome whatsoever, stick them in a room, give them tons of chemotherapy to completely annihilate their immune system and their microbiome, and then hope they survive this symptom of isolation on top of their disease process.
It's the best we got right now. I wouldn't tell people not to. I mean, I've seen people say, I'm not going to do that, and then watch them fall apart, So I'm not a fan of it, but I've seen it work for enough people that are still alive 15, 20 years later. So yeah, I'm not gonna knock it when you need it. But I mean, my argument is integrative medicine. Like why can't you have them getting acupuncture and doing mindfulness meditation and taking probiotics and antioxidants and eating broccoli and things like that. There's cells called dendritic cells, for example. They send out these little periscopes, and they're sampling everything we eat. They know exactly what's going on. They know exactly the kind of balances or imbalances that we have in our gut microbiome. And then I hate to use this word, they choose how they're going to respond. And it's not really magic. It seems kind of magical, but if a dendritic cell sees a probiotic like Lactobacillus acidophilus, there's a kind of molecular signal that dendritic cell gets from the Lactobacillus acidophilus that actually programs the DNA of the dendritic cell, and then that dendritic cell sends out messages to lymphocytes and says, okay, you can be assured that this guy is not a problem. Be cool.
And so our medical practice, our medical interventions tend to be isolating just as our punitive measures do in a prison or in a psych ward or anything else. And so at the cell level, you can almost picture the same thing happening. Here's a damaged cell that's just trying to hang on to life. And all of a sudden, it's getting bombarded with toxicity. And its tendency is actually to get more aggressive. And so one of the things that we do is measure circulating cancer cells in the bloodstream. And what we've seen this in multiple breast cancer patients where that circulating amount of cancer in the bloodstream actually goes up during chemotherapy. And it almost makes sense. You just are putting a stressed out cell that is barely hanging on to life into a bigger stress state. It's going to do the only thing that it can do, which is replicate faster, more intensely, more desperately. When you stop the chemo, then you can see that suddenly settle back down to its baseline as to where maybe it was before chemotherapy. But in the meantime, you've shed cells all over the body because of the stress you've put it through. Contrast this then to surrounding that person with microbiome. And we've gotten to see now some circumstances where you take somebody who has cancer, prostate, breast, doesn't really matter, and they have circulating cancer cells. And then you surround their bloodstream and everything else with information from the microbiome. We're not smart enough yet to know which bacteria need to go into a system as complex as the microbiome. However, what we've decided a safer approach is to eliminate the bacteria and fungi and just put their communication into play. Because it turns out that all of the species contribute to a wireless communication network. If you put that wireless communication network back into play, you can see the blood sterilize itself on many occasions, which means we've given nothing toxic, we've just given information back to the environment, And suddenly you can see the cancer cells induce cell suicide. They suddenly realize life is all around them. They're part of a larger organism. And their job now is to bring in a replacement, not just to try to survive as the only isolated thing left.
Unbelievable. I'm the last of my species. I don't see anyone around. I have no choice but to replicate aggressively to survive of my species. Oh no, we're fine.
Yeah. Oh, the organism's there. I'm one of 70 trillion. There's no expectation on self to keep going.
We know the details of exactly how the DNA is being programmed. And we know that message that goes to the lymphocyte is a very precise message. How do we know this? Because there are actually drugs that are being used right now to treat cancer that can activate that mechanism where the dendritic cells talk to the lymphocytes. There's what's called co-stimulatory molecules. I know this is quite technical, but those co-stimulatory molecules come about as a result of that initial exposure to the good guy or the bad guy. Well, the drug companies have found we can manipulate these co-stimulatory molecules. If we turn them on, the lymphocytes suddenly become very, very aggressive, and they will kill cancer. Well, that's great if the person has malignant melanoma, because this could get rid of their cancer. But you know what the side effect of those drugs is? Autoimmune disease. What I would submit to you is that nature's got all this figured out. Nature's got this figured out. When we try to manipulate it, when we try to fool with it, we can create a problem.
I went to undergrad at the University of Pennsylvania, and I was lucky enough to take this course on cancer. And I wasn't pre-med at all. Never thought I'd go to med school. Wasn't even on my radar. But I took this really interesting seminar with Dr. Peter Knowles, who's one of the fathers of genomics and the relationship between genetics and cancer. And it was on the sociology, epidemiology, and biology of cancer. And it was all these pre-meds. It was this really cool class. And at the time, my grandmother was dying of colon cancer, and she had effectively smoked her way into that disease and smoked her way into the grave. And, you know, and those were in the early days when people didn't know how bad cigarettes were for you. But here's this thing that you're inhaling through your mouth that's causing cancer in your colon, right? So it's even a few links away. And now we know that's well established, but for a long time, people didn't. And so it was at that time. And I ended up writing this paper during this class on alternative therapies for cancer. And I got down this rabbit hole of research on PubMed and looking at the scientific literature and looking at all of the dietary factors for cancer and the toxic factors for cancer, like cigarettes, like alcohol, and getting really mad and just being like, none of this has to happen. NCI, National Cancer Institute, 50% of cancer at least is preventable through diet and some of these other changes. And yet all of our energy is going towards these incredibly sophisticated and often toxic medications to treat cancer once it's taken hold. And no one's caring about looking at the whole person and looking at these other factors that we actually have a lot of power over. And so that was kind of the impetus and inspired me, I think, ultimately to not just pursue medicine, but to think a little bit differently about what I wanted to do in it.
You know, the microbiome is like a barometer. It kind of tells you what's going on. When the barometer is falling, that's not what's causing the storm. That is what is reflecting the storm. And in that sense, the microbiome may be useful. Could be affected by antibiotics, of course, but also diet or different kinds of food additives or the pesticides that are given to plants, or even chlorine in water. I mean, there are so many ways in which we are affecting our microbiome that we didn't a few hundred years ago.
We know what we've lost because you could identify species that we don't have. Are there any particular traits that you're seeing missing on the board? It's like, okay, these bugs are gone, and these bugs, as far as we know, did X, Y, and Z, right?
Well, the bug that I started with was Helicobacter pylori, the bug that was the dominant organism in the stomach. And it was discovered in the 19th century at a time when everybody had it. And then again in the late 20th century, by which time it had disappeared from more than half the people. And at that time, the scientists in Australia, Robin Warren and Barry Marshall, linked that bacteria to ulcers. And that was a very important discovery. It changed our whole approach to ulcer disease. And they won the Nobel Prize, and it identified Helicobacter as a bad guy, as a pathogen. And since then, doctors have been trying to eliminate it from everybody. But there's more and more evidence that Helicobacter has benefits as well. it benefits our immunity. And it may be that the loss of Helicobacter is one of the factors that's driving childhood asthma. We and others have data that support that. There's evidence that Helicobacter is bad for your stomach, but it's good for your esophagus. With Helicobacter disappearing, we have diseases of the esophagus that are increasing dramatically, like reflux, and something called Barrett's esophagus, and a form of cancer that was very rare, which is the fastest increasing cancer in the United States of the esophagus. There are new forms of stomach cancer that didn't seem to exist before. So these organisms that are highly interactive with us, the same organism may have both good features and bad features.
So when Helicobacter goes out of control, next thing you know, you're on antibiotics, proton pump inhibitors, all the stuff that people end up getting on because of ulcers. Is there another type of species that might have been there synergistically that has allowed this to go out of balance, or is it the specific one?
The question is, a lot of people have Helicobacter, only a few people get ulcers, and a few people get stomach cancer. So why is it those people and not the others? And that's an active area of research. We don't know the answers.
The majority of microbiome studies, I would say maybe 99%, when you look at them, you could say, okay, this person has cancer, this person doesn't have cancer. You see a dysbiosis in one person and you don't see it in the healthy person. And I think the reality is that the dysbiosis is an indicator of the disease condition. It's very hard for us to say that pathogen or this bacteria cause cancer in an individual. We really have, I would say, almost no examples of that. But we see correlation. So we see a breakdown in the microbiome, less diversity of species, some species completely absent, some pathogenic species become dominant, which is dysbiotic in nature compared to a healthy group of people. But in terms of saying cause and effect, other than looking at C. diff patients and seeing that the pathogen causes a disorder, we have very limited examples. I think the organisms are taking advantage of low oxygen or a particular nutrient that's present in the tumor and starting to grow there. So again, this is true that they are seeing organisms in unhealthy tissue throughout the body, and I think it's a matter of taking advantage of that environment. But the flip side of this is that we're now in a position where we can take advantage of those organisms, right? So if we know Fusobacterium likes to grow in a tumor, why don't we create species that are able to consume tumor cells? And I think that this is definitely an area of the microbiome that warrants further research, taking advantage of organisms that we think are bad for us and seeing how we can utilize them in areas where they grow, for example, in tumor tissue or create a disease in the gut or the lining of the gut.
It almost comes back to kind of the metaphor of gardening and healthy soil. If your soil is unhealthy, bad things grow there, type of thing. So can you speak to that metaphor for just kind of the human health condition in the gut and all that, just what a healthy environment would look like?
In terms of a healthy environment, and I'm sure this surprises you, but I'm an avid gardener. And I have seen some years that the garden's just been fabulous and gorgeous, and some years it's struggled. And usually the years where it's done really well are the years where I've gotten rid of grubs in the soil and I've added fertilizer and taken all the weeds out and given it what it needs to be healthy. And I think the same thing happens with the human body. I do believe that if you give the human microbiome what it needs to be maintained in a healthy state, either feeding the bacteria or not putting too much stress on your body, getting the right diet, and getting enough sleep, that we definitely see the positive benefits of that.
We drop pesticides on our plants, we sterilize our shrink-wrapped food, and we bomb cancer. Perhaps we're seeing a recurrent theme here. A worldview or operating system that's been holding us in an us versus them approach. Them? Who's the enemy anyhow? Nature? We see a war against nature itself on a planetary scale and on an interpersonal one, waging war against the microbes that connect us with all life. This shift away from military-style medicine into a more holistic and nature-friendly model is rocking the foundations of healthcare. We've seen the light, but it's taking time to shake off old habits and belief systems. Here are some key points from this last powerful segment. As cancer is rising, microbial diversity is decreasing. Is there a connection? There are different types of bacteria found around cancerous cells versus healthy ones. Can this inform diagnosis and treatment? If so, this means we may be able to detect a pro-cancerous environment years before cancer arrives by understanding what bacteria belong where. And we know that there's a web of life that seems to communicate information from cell to cell, and that the microbes are a key link in this signaling. They're the missing puzzle piece. We also know that genetic predisposition is only part of the equation. Lifestyle and terrain are critical components that can't be overlooked. Amazing, isn't it? The microbiome appears to hold the key to winning the battle against cancer. Remember, you can own the complete Interconnected documentary series at home. Just click the link below this video and you get all the details. You can still view every episode for free over these 9 days, but I encourage you not to risk missing an episode. There's too much good stuff in here. These are revelations that are important. Plus, when you purchase the full set, you'll qualify for some amazing bonuses that are not being seen here, including 2 live Q&A sessions where you can ask the experts anything you want, and you get this collection of companion guides that cover everything from cooking to gardening to fermenting at home. Guaranteed Interconnected is leading the way on this next frontier of medicine. So please click the link below, check out our limited time discount offer. It's only available while these episodes are live. Come back in a few days and it's too late. So grab your copy of Interconnected now. It's the power to heal from within, and you can discover how we can win the war against cancer and fight these chronic diseases. Now we pivot back to the gut. Why? Because our experts have consistently taught us that this is where 70% of our immune system resides. And with all of the food and environmental challenges confronting our microbiome, this is an important system to nurture. The immune system is where inflammation starts and where autoimmune reactions tend to happen. So when we look at cancer, diabetes, or any other condition, we need to go back to the root of the problem and start making corrections there.
We're most excited about the basic biology, about basically discovering how the microbiome or microbes in our gut or environment work with our immune system and our nervous system. So essentially trying to understand what is the fundamental aspects of just our own biology.
I realized how the intestinal tract was the biggest immune organ of the body. The intestinal tract could create inflammation if we weren't eating the right things, if we were eating foods that we were sensitive to, and that inflammation could be the underlying cause of so much of the chronic, complex illness that we see today.
Remember, one of the key functions of the microbiome is to maintain the gut lining integrity and that part of your immune system. So helping that to heal after an insult can be really important. And then eating lots of whole, generally plant-based foods, those fibers in those whole foods feed the good bugs and the good bugs grow.
So I learned about the importance of microbiome and immunity because of the importance of the relationship between inflammation in the gut and the immune system. And then around the year 2000, that's when the medical literature started talking about the bacteria, and it's the bacteria that matter. And in fact, that was in 2000. Now we actually have something called the Human Microbiome Project, which is very similar to the Human Genome Project, where the National Institutes of Health is actually committed to really understanding in a very, very detailed way what is the composition of the microbiome.
The immune system is a set of specialized cells that are either roving around the body or they're what's called sessile, meaning they're hanging out in certain places. For example, we have mast cells in every surface of our body. And those mast cells are basically hanging out, sampling everything that's going by. They're sampling, pollens or infections or things like that, and they're quote making a decision about whether there's something worth reacting to there. So the name of the game with immune cells is they are programmed to react to things in the environment.
What is happening in this lab that makes you most excited? Like, what are some of these findings that are really intriguing?
It's traditional wisdom that the immune system responds to bacteria, but customarily we think of infectious agents and how the immune system attacks microbes that may be invading us. Well, what we've learned over the past decade is that our immune system is actually augmented or primed by the microbiome. In other words, the microbiome improves the function of our immune system. It augments certain activities that are not found in the absence of a microbiome.
The whole immune system was set up in a very primitive way to be able to reject foreign invaders or to repair against some kind of trauma or damage. And these cells are made in the bone marrow, and they're made in the thymus when we're very, very young. And then there's also a little bit going on in the spleen. So they're made in these organs, and then they're released into the environment. And as I said, they either take up residence in places like the skin or the lining of the nose or the lining of the gut, or they're constantly in circulation. Many people think that the immune system is mostly in circulation. But it's also lining the gut. It's also lining the nose. It's lining the eyes. It's lining the mouth.
And guess why we have an immune system? It's basically because of the microbial world. And the normal function of our immune system in this cohabited body of ours is just proper management of relationships. It's think of the mediator in a dispute between partners in a business relationship, or think about the folks that broker discussions between large organizations. That's our immune system, and so it's absolutely essential for the normal relationships that we have with our microbes.
And so again, it's a conceptual shift in thinking that the immune system actually requires certain bacteria, non-infectious bacteria, for its optimal activity. And if the immune system doesn't function properly, then that actually results in human diseases. So again, beyond infectious disease, an overactive immune system results in allergy, results in autoimmunity, such as multiple sclerosis and lupus and rheumatoid arthritis. And again, all of these disorders being linked back to the microbiome, at least largely in animal models, but in some human studies, suggest that modulation of the immune system by the microbiome may be a potential therapeutic option for allergy and autoimmunity.
Can you speak to the experience of the patient in this case? It might start with fatigue, it might start with brain fog, like this could be going on for a minute before they start becoming properly symptomatic. They just don't feel well.
So there's so much interconnection between the microbial world, for example, in our gut, and the biology going on in the gut wall, and then the rest of us. And this semi-permeable, selective transport barrier, which is normally bringing signaling molecules and metabolites and immune regulators across deliberately, can easily become overwhelmed or faulty or broken. And now some of those same immune regulators that were doing normal monitoring and maintenance functions are causing an immune response that is subtle and yet insidious and almost profoundly basic to how we feel and how we operate. And it's exactly those same kinds of immune signaling molecules that cause fatigue, that cause poor nutritional status. So there's literally a physical basis for this fatigue. These same molecules cause fever. They cause and regulate immune function throughout the body in places where immune function is itself linked to local cell function in the liver, local cell function in the brain, local cell function, you name it. And that's why these breakdowns in barriers are so fundamentally important to everything about who we are and what regulates our normal health status.
So we know we have a handful of examples of organisms that can modulate the immune system in a beneficial way. In some cases, the actual molecules of those organisms are known, and they're secretive factors that are sensed by our own immune cells and then augment the function of those immune cells. But unfortunately, in a vast majority of cases where the microbiome has been linked to an autoimmune condition, we don't know the specific organisms which are mediating those health benefits, and therefore we don't know their molecules. But this is ongoing work. Many laboratories are interested in identifying particular organisms and molecules as a mechanism to develop new therapies.
What's happening on the skin is 9 times out of 10 happening inside. There are some genetic conditions that can lead to leaky epidermal barrier that if you want to talk about, we can talk about and need to be addressed locally. But by and large, it's an inside-out job. So acne is an inside-out job. You can do secondary topicals and applications, but yeah, acne, in my experience, teen acne, requires a dietary change. It requires a significant drop in the sugar. It requires pulling out the top antigenic foods. Very commonly it's dairy, which is really hard for a teen to give up. But, acne's tough to live with. And my experience treating many kids with acne, they're really, by the time they come into my practice, they're willing to go the distance and hang in there with the diet. Some quote-unquote gut work is going to be needed. We're going to measure what's going on, look at what's going on in the microbiome. We'll look at nutrients and correct those. And along with a good, healthy, clean, low processed, low antigenic, high veggie diet, you can turn around acne. I mean, it's very doable.
We have incredible patient stories, and in our approach to medicine, we often, if not always, I hate to say always for anything, but we almost always start with the gut.
So there's an interesting thing about eczema, right? I mean, most parents will come with kids and they have this presentation of eczema somewhere, whatever, face, knuckles, whatever, could be anywhere. And most oftentimes they're seeing a dermatologist. The dermatologist says, well, you need some sort of antibiotic, you need some sort of cream, you need something to knock out this eczema.
Great patient example. I had a 24-year-old woman with Behçet's autoimmune vasculitis. This is an autoimmune disease that results in ulcers in the mouth and all the way down the esophagus. Young woman, she also had acne, weight gain, insomnia. She was just inflamed. She had been fired by the top rheumatologist at Cornell because none of his drugs were working.
The reality is if you can intervene early enough with these kids with certain what's called prebiotics, you can reverse the eczema. So there's something called fructooligosaccharides, very sweet. It's almost like sugar, right? And if you can titrate the levels up on these kids of fructooligosaccharides early on in their life, we're talking 1 year of age or younger or 2, and you can get the levels of these things to increase, you'll see the eczema go down. So that's telling me, as we see in the research studies, right, that the eczema isn't necessarily a skin presentation. The eczema is a gut presentation. And most often, it's missing microbes. It's missing gut bugs.
And so she came to us at my practice, and, honestly, I was nervous. This is a high table stakes type of patient. I really want to help her, and I'm hoping that this approach will help. But we know that the immune system is regulated through the gut, through the microbiome, that leaky gut can play into it, that oftentimes people have developed food sensitivities that they didn't necessarily have, day one of life, but they might have developed later on. And so we took what's known as our gut healing approach with this patient. We eliminated a number of trigger foods that are common in autoimmunity, like gluten, like dairy, like sugar, a few others.
I mean, you see trials where if parents will hand wash dishes versus putting them in the dishwasher, kids get less eczema.
We embarked on, over 6 weeks, a gut healing protocol, including a couple of supplements, some probiotics, some supplements that help heal that lining of the gut that's gotten disrupted, some supplements that help kill off some of the bad bacteria, because on her stool test she had a preponderance of yeast because she'd had a lot of medications and antibiotics over the years, especially for the acne. And then she'd seen me twice, and then I'm like, okay, we got to keep going. This takes a long time. I'll see you in a month or so. And she comes back in, and I'm nervous, honestly, because I'm like, what if she's not better, right? I'm like, this. And she comes back, and ulcers are completely gone. Disease is basically in remission. Her skin is cleared up. She's sleeping. She's losing weight. Her mother's crying in my office because we've given her young daughter her life back. I still get emotional when I talk about this case. And her mother's been a patient of ours now for a while as well. And it's incredible, right? But we just looked holistically at the patient and we understood that the immune system is being triggered by something and the immunosuppressive drugs aren't enough, right? If you don't address the underlying cause of a problem, it will always outpace the drug's ability to suppress it.
You'll see trials where if the parents will drop a pacifier on the ground and pick it up instead of rinsing it off under the water, they'll lick it and then give it back to the kid. You'll get lower eczema. So it's implying, in dogs and if they're growing up on farms, meaning if they get more exposure to lots of different bugs, the kids don't get eczema.
The next case, Johnny, he came in with rheumatoid arthritis, and they were wanting to put him on a strong immunosuppressive drug to help with his RA, which causes joint pain and joint destruction. And he said, I don't have any digestive symptoms, but I'm wondering if there's something in the gut causing these symptoms. And so we found small intestinal bacterial overgrowth with Johnny, and we used a course of herbal antimicrobials, and he responded fantastically. He was using medication previously on and off. He was using some steroids and anti-inflammatories, was able to come off all medications and felt fantastic.
I can talk a little bit about rheumatoid arthritis because I have a number of patients that I treat with that, and I do think the microbiome is a very important part of that. We know, for example, that there's certain bacteria or combinations of bacteria that can trigger rheumatoid arthritis. Very good work done on that.
And there's been other data published showing an elemental diet, which is essentially a gut-friendly meal replacement, can be as effective as the drug prednisone in quelling inflammation and treating RA. An elemental diet is essentially a meal replacement that's hypoallergenic, pre-digested, and gut-friendly. It's oftentimes used in people with inflammatory bowel disease because it can be, because of all the ingredients being pre-digested, your intestines don't have to work at all to absorb everything. And if you have something like a bacterial overgrowth, since the solution is absorbed in the first couple feet of the small intestine, nothing makes its way down the line and can't feed any of the bacteria down the line.
I've been doing microbiome testing really since it first became available. I started doing the earlier stool testing where you look for certain organisms. Did you see if they would grow? Look at them under a microscope. But then when the DNA testing came out, we called this sequencing-based testing. I was an early adopter, so I've been doing this for many, many years in our practice. At first, there was a lot of excitement about it. We thought, okay, we're going to find the one bug that caused rheumatoid arthritis or the one bug that caused autoimmune thyroiditis. And we had pretty good literature that appeared to show those associations. The problem is that when I actually started doing the testing, I didn't find those bugs. What I tended to find was that there was a low diversity and richness. Now, these are technical terms that the biologists use, the microbiologists use to describe the health of the overall microbiome. And this is, I think, something that most everybody agrees upon.
There is a lot of interest in microbiome and asthma. Again, asthma has just shot up after World War II. And consistent with this period when our microbiome seems to have changed the most, the era of antibiotics. And it may be that the loss of Helicobacter is one of the factors that's driving childhood asthma. We and others have data that support that. And so we're interested in Helicobacter as a protector. We're also interested in certain organisms in the intestine as protectors. There have been some studies of children showing certain organisms are associated with protection from later risk of asthma. So this is a rapidly emerging field. This may be one of the fields where there'll be breakthroughs more rapidly than other fields.
The immune system has different ways of responding. Some of it is very specific and some of it is general. And I think what it takes for the immune system to decide, now we got a problem, versus this is kind of normal noise and background. We need to be aware, but not go crazy.
So when you see someone with kind of compromised immunity and kind of recurrent upper respiratory infections, is there a common pattern that you see in like just mouth dysbiosis or something?
The connections between mouth and lungs and intestine are complicated. They do include the immune system, which regulates and acts locally, but also has systemic effects. So what happens, what happens in the gut does affect the lung through the immune system, and vice versa, potentially. But then there are the organisms that themselves make their way from the gut back up into the mouth and down into the lungs. And there is a connection there. It's complicated because it involves stomach acid, it involves abnormalities of esophageal function, but it is clear that asthma is more common in people who have reflux, esophagitis, and reflux of material from the upper intestines up into the mouth and oral pharynx. And those are definitely places of leverage where we can potentially modify the likelihood of something like asthma.
So we know, especially from studies on the microbiome in the gut, that environmental toxins have a dramatic impact on the bacteria and fungus in the gut. It really disrupts things. So what I found is that a lot of people will really have a flare-up of these chronic sinusitis if they're either living in toxic mold or they're exposed to chemicals. So a lot of times if we can do the work to help to detoxify the body and to make sure that they're not being exposed somewhere in their environment, whether it's their home, their car, their work, their school, then the immune system works better to keep the microbiome and the sinuses intact.
I had sinus infections all the time as a kid, so I just took antibiotics every month for years because that's what doctors said to do, every time disabling my gut. I wish I hadn't have done that.
I do the least invasive things first. We build the gut microbiome, we make sure the sinuses are treated, we make sure that the body has all the nutrients that it needs to do the rebuilding. And then if they're still not getting better, then they probably need an antifungal that crosses the brain, because obviously we can't do a brain biopsy. I had been really leery about using silver because to me it's the metal, and I see a lot of people with heavy metal toxicity. So I was like, I don't really feel comfortable doing that. But as far as the sinus, it's really, really helpful because it has some antibacterial and then some antifungal coverage.
I went from sinus infections every month for about 15 years of my life to almost never getting one. And if that starts to happen, instead of taking antibiotics, I use this amazing antibiotic that we used before we had them. It's called iodine. And what I do is based on an old Ayurvedic yoga technique, but you put your face in a bowl of iodized salt water and you wash your sinuses. Who would have thought? Stuff like that, that's been known traditionally for a long time, works really, really effectively. And if I had to use an antibiotic, it would be in a nasal spray. Why would I kill my gut bacteria so I could hopefully get to my sinuses? It doesn't even make sense, but that's what we've always done, so that's what we keep doing.
One of the interesting stories that I have from one of my personal patients is that, cockroach can actually be very allergenic. And, in talking to this person with chronic sinus problems, discovered that through the conversation that there had been issues with cockroaches in the apartment that they had. And so you can see how these triggers can just incite an immune reaction in your body. And, I may be exposed to cockroach and not have a problem. You may be exposed to cockroach and may have a problem. And that could have the reason for that could be because of the resiliency of our immune system.
If you have something like a really bad headache and it's only happening once a year, by all means, take an ibuprofen. If you're chronically having headaches and you're chronically taking these medications that also then have side effects and are causing abdominal pain and bleeding and other issues, you're pretty motivated to try something else. And so I think people are beginning to understand that true health and well-being is the long game and are looking for solutions that get them there.
The headaches for me were pretty big, and it would come on all the time, and it would really, really drive me nuts. And so a friend of mine at that time said, why don't you go see a naturopathic doctor? And I remember going, a what? A natural what? I never heard of such a thing.
Well, in my experience, diet is always a piece of migraine headaches. Without question. It's always a piece of it, even if they cycle with hormones. So even if you're sure that this is related to sex hormone imbalances, and the diet is just always a piece. And that means that the microbiome is a piece of it, and the gut integrity is the piece. Sometimes there are nutrient insufficiencies. Magnesium is commonly needed. Sometimes allergies play a piece, but inflammatory reactions to foods always, in my experience, play a piece in migraine headache patients.
And so I went to see this lady in Vancouver, and it really changed my life because in the first 90 minutes, first of all, I'd never spent so long with a doctor in my life. Usually I had a prescription as soon as I sat down. And so it was just fascinating that she asked such deep questions. I mean, they're not very deep, it was just detailed. It was really thorough. And I can't believe that she figured out what was causing a lot of my headaches.
I generally use a combination of an elimination diet, pulling out the top antigenic foods like wheat, egg, dairy, so forth, soy. And then I'll do some laboratory testing to see if there are any outlier reactions. And then we embark on a therapeutic diet program for a set period of agreed upon time, so my patient's really clear of what they're getting into. And they work with a nutritionist to make sure that it's nutritionally replete. And then we will challenge those foods one at a time to see what the culprit foods are. This particular migraine patient that you're asking me about came to me in our first office visit before I had any laboratory data on her, told me that without question she would not give up eggs. And I said, okay, but let's just at least look. Can we just test? And then she comes back to the office and we review everything in the second visit, and then I'll prescribe the plan. And sure enough, I mean, I knew this would be the case. I've seen egg as a culprit in migraine headaches a handful of times, but wildly allergic to eggs. And so the data actually helped compel her, all right, to reluctantly agree to give up her eggs. I mean, it's kind of a funny story because she just totally dug her heels in around eggs. And I didn't even say anything. So anyway, during that therapeutic trial, her migraine headaches stopped.
So I ask this of everyone. If you, God forbid, were to develop some sort of chronic disease, an autoimmune disease, what would you do for yourself?
I would go see myself at my practice or go see one of our other amazing physicians who work with us. I would do a gut healing protocol. I would eliminate trigger foods. I would work with supplements that help heal the gut and lower inflammation in the body.
The gut microbiome produces lipopolysaccharides and things that impact our immune system and modulate our immune function. And it also creates neuropeptides that modulate our mood. So every aspect of a human biochemistry book takes place in the gut microbiome.
I would do in-depth testing of genomics and the microbiome and hormones and toxins and take a really broad look. I would sit back with myself and say, what triggered this? Was I under an amazing amount of stress at some point? We know that stress, and this is well established, stress is the #1 trigger for autoimmune flares.
We did a study in 2014 where we took 400 healthy blood donors and we checked their blood to see what type of antibodies they produced. And if people had lost their immune tolerance and started to react against food proteins, and the food proteins we were checking were milk and wheat proteins, we found that 50% of them had antibodies to their brain tissue, meaning that their immune system was causing an inflammatory reaction in their brain.
Old-time doctors who were practicing naturopathic medicine would ask somebody to list their favorite foods and be like, okay, those are what you're stopping. I mean, that's like the old-time trick to identify what people are reactive to.
The problem is many people, when they start to react to foods, start restricting all their foods. And when they start restricting all their foods, they lose their gut diversity. So we're actually having a complete change in how we treat patients with chronic inflammation and food sensitivities by looking at the microbiome and encouraging them to eat a really high plant-based type vegetable protein source so they can really get that function back.
So we know now that what we're eating repeatedly, we're more vulnerable to mounting an immune response to if we've got a damaged microbiome and any degree of intestinal permeability, because it's those proteins that are going to be exposed to the immune system over and over and over again.
I think there's maybe two extremes that come into this. There's a woman who is just starting on her journey, and she can benefit just by getting off of soda and sugar and processed foods. And for her, it's kind of easy. Go on a unprocessed food diet, a whole foods diet, and you'll likely see a lot of benefit. But then there's a person who's been at this for a little while, they've been reading, they've been researching, and now they come in, I can't have gluten, I can't have grains, I've also heard that I have an autoimmune condition, so I can't have any of the foods not allowed by the autoimmune paleo diet, which are nightshades and eggs and nuts and seeds and beans. And so very quickly people end up cutting all these foods out of their diet without a plan for how to figure out, what should they not be on and what should they be on. And oftentimes when they get to my office, they're off of a number of foods. Sometimes they're underweight or really tired because they're not eating enough. And as soon as a person in a position of authority says, you know what, you can bring these foods back in and you'll probably be okay, but let's see how you do. And then they start introducing and eating more foods. They come back in 3 weeks later, I feel so much better. I had some gluten, I had a little bit of dairy. Yeah, the dairy bloated me a little bit, but it wasn't too bad, and the gluten was actually okay.
So the key concept is once your microbiome loses its diversity, you lose tolerance. And as your microbiome becomes more diverse, you gain tolerance, and then you're not as reactive to yourself or to the food, proteins, or chemicals around you.
Really two aspects here that are key. There's the microbiome, which is the world of bacteria and other life that live in your gut, and then how those bacteria and other life interface with the immune system. And that's one of the pieces that is sometimes left out of the equation, which is the immune system is very important also, because food reactions are in part, in large part, mediated by your immune system. So it's not just the bacteria, it's also the immune system.
Our microbiome is interconnected to our entire body, and our gut is constantly communicating with our brain, our lungs, our hormones. And this inner community has so much to do with our overall health and well-being. We can use this knowledge to help heal ourselves and our loved ones. It's important to work with your doctor as you work through eating, drinking, and living more probiotically. Our journey through the microbiome connection has the hope we need to have more control over our health than ever before, as we see all these interconnections with our body's systems. Here's a quick review of what we've learned. 70% of our immune system is around our gut lining. Skin disorders, allergies, migraines, sinusitis, and hormonal problems all trace back to the gut and an unhealthy microbiome. Often, it's not specific strains, but a lack of diversity causing these problems. This diversity comes from a diet rich in colorful fruits and vegetables. We also see that missing fructooligosaccharides may be the culprit for people with skin problems. It's hard to believe that the microbes in our gut can affect so many illnesses we suffer from. But what about the #1 condition in America? What about heart disease? It's killing millions every year, and what we've learned about the microbiome may be the missing link to a solution. Perhaps we've been chasing the wrong culprits? Here's what some great minds in science and medicine told me.
We know there's a connection between the microbiome and cardiovascular disease because when you take out plaque, you often find bacteria in there. Now, it was a misconception for years that the body was basically sterile, that you only had bacteria in your nose and your mouth and your gut, but you didn't have bacteria anywhere else. We used to think the womb was sterile, but now we know there are bacteria all over the place. Again, most of them are hiding, they're not causing any problems, and the immune system is tolerant. So what about the bacteria they find in the plaque? What's that bacteria doing there? Is it is it just hanging out? Did it find a nice nice apartment to live for a while, or is it actually part of the process? Some people believe that those bacteria are part of the process. What's some of the data that kind of leads us to think that? Well, we know there's a strong connection between gum disease and heart disease. And what is that? We know that if you've got certain bacteria in your mouth, overgrowth of certain bacteria, it creates systemic inflammation in the body. So it could just be that the local inflammation in the mouth from those unhealthy bacteria causes systemic inflammation. Or maybe the local inflammation in the gums is creating leaky gum syndrome, not leaky gut syndrome, but leaky gum syndrome. And those bacteria are seeping into the bloodstream and they're ending up in any irritated areas that line the arteries and saying, hey, I'm going to take up residence. This looks like a good spot. And then the immune system says, wait a minute, you shouldn't be there. So there's a reaction to them. And that reaction causes inflammation and swelling and eventually plaque formation.
Heart disease is not just because cholesterol is blocking your arteries. We now know that it's so much deeper than that. Now there's different particles that they're talking about, small particles, large particles, but even beneath that is inflammation. The immune system that's imbalanced, it's in kind of like a startle state, where the whole person is in a imbalance in the autonomic nervous system, or the hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal axis, which is a simplistic way of understanding. It's basically how the body gets back into balance. That's out of balance. And those are the systems that bring us back to a balanced, healing state.
I'm the fourth doctor in my family, and when I decided to go into medicine, I met Dean Ornish, who came to Omaha, Nebraska when I was a senior in high school, and showed that if you had a heart disease and were scheduled for a heart bypass, that you could use lifestyle medicine and not need the bypass. Now, 35 years later, we found he was right. And a big factor of the inflammation in the heart that causes heart disease is the inflammation in the gut. I think of it as fire in the gut, fire in the heart, and also know fire in the brain, because what happens in the microbiome of the gut can drive the microbiome inflammation throughout the rest of the body.
The biggest things I see are patients who are on cholesterol-lowering medication. And if you actually look at the research, looking at a 10-year, 20-year, 30-year, 40-year decrease in having a stroke or a heart attack being on a statin, you'd actually be amazed at how many cardiologists or doctors actually don't know the stats. And if you look at the stats, it's amazing how misconstrued it is, even in the guidelines of cardiology, and how it's actually you're decreasing the risk maybe by 2.7%. But if you were to look at, well, why is that patient's cholesterol high? Is it that it's recirculating and being reabsorbed in the gut and not going out? Or is it that the liver is making too much, which is statin medication addresses? So it's amazing. It's just education. I don't think many of us are actually taught at what the root cause of the issue is. And so, of course, if I thought the cholesterol was the issue, which 50% of heart attacks and strokes happen with perfectly normal cholesterol levels, then of course my role would be to lower it or to get rid of it. But now we're finding, okay, it's the bystander possibly, and maybe there's endothelial issues going on that's dysfunctional, and that's coming there for a reason, and that's really not the issue. So statins being one of the sort of billion-dollar industry and one of the #1 drugs used, that makes a lot of money. Is it really saving lives? Is it really doing more harm than good? I don't know. It's a good question to ask.
One of my most disheartening cases while I was a medical student was a woman that came in with abdominal pain. And she had had abdominal pain for 3 days, and they decided it was her gallbladder. She was scheduled for surgery. I asked for an EKG, which is a tracing of the heart. It showed she'd been having a heart attack for 3 days, and no one ever considered it could have been her heart. She ended up having emergency surgery. She was told after the surgery that half of her heart was damaged and that she would be a cardiac cripple the rest of her life. That was not good enough for me. So I sought out one of the world's experts in metabolic cardiology that knows if you add coenzyme Q10, carnitine, D-ribose, magnesium, some of these mitochondrial supporters. The mitochondria are the factories of your cells, how they take food and make energy, and you can spray a little WD-40 in them and make them spin faster. So I decided at that time to never let this happen again.
I would say the #1 thing I see on the rise is patients with heart disease. Younger patients dying earlier. I mean, the things I saw, for example, fatty liver. I always thought it's something that happens in older men, alcoholics. I just had a 35-year-old female, with fatty liver, and that's a big deal. That means your liver can no longer do its job like it used to, and the liver is so important for longevity, for how long you live. To go back to, how this affects your health, the microbiome, the microbes that live with you, I think the biggest thing I see is not just gut health. I think most people think the microbiome has to do with indigestion, bloating, gas, diarrhea, constipation. But to be honest, for me, it's actually more about the bigger organs that really affect your sort of longevity, which is your liver, your heart, or your brain.
Can we talk about these kind of full
body systems approach to medicine that's now starting to come up, and what that means for all of us to just change our diet, like downstream.
If you look at a lot of chronic diseases, like heart disease and hypertension and diabetes and obesity, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, all of these diseases have a component of inflammation. Many of these diseases have probably been made worse by poor dietary choices. I'm not suggesting that there's an immediate correlation, but diet matters. I mean, there is this idea of food as medicine. And what we eat and the nutrients that we take up, feed all of the cells in our body just as they feed all of the bacteria in our microbiomes.
There's this food industrial complex that's also tied into the medical complex, right? I mean, it's $1 trillion industry in and of itself that's just on chronic disease, right? So can you talk about the relationship between this like junk food behemoth and the chronic disease business that just keeps kind of passing the patient between each other?
I've got a friend who went in for heart surgery recently. And he came out, as he went in, he was wheeled into the operating room, and he was looking at his wife and kids, looking at him. And that was the hardest moment of all for him, because he saw his kids looking at him, not knowing if they would ever see their dad again. And he came out of the heart surgery, thank goodness. He survived it. And then they served him a cheeseburger for his first meal in the hospital. The doctor said not a word about the connection between food and health.
We do an abysmal job in heart disease prevention in our medical system right now. We're looking at 4 very basic markers. The current studies show that the statin drugs really don't work well for women, particularly after menopause, and that there's possibly a 50% risk of diabetes in women using those medications.
At first he said, I don't want to make any change because I don't know how long I've got to live, and I don't want to give up the one biggest pleasure I've got left. My body doesn't work all that well. It's painful to be me. It's painful to be alive, and I don't want to give up the pleasure of the foods I'm familiar with. And his wife said, but sweetheart, I want you in my life, and I want our kids to have a dad. And so we've got to make these changes. So thank goodness he did. And he lost 40 pounds. And he got off all of his high blood pressure medications. And his heart is functioning beautifully and healthfully. And he's now hiking and jogging and running. And it's gotten easier and easier to love foods that love him back. And so my friend is a symbol to me of what's at stake here. Because he had the good fortune to find out the truth and a wife who helped him put it into action. But not all of us have that luck. And it's why there's 14 million people dying a year from heart disease every single year on this planet. It's the #1 most easily preventable disease there is. The Tarahumara Indians in Mexico have no heart disease. I mean, like 0. If you were a heart surgeon there, you would be unemployed. You'd make more money selling pencils.
So what we like to do is we look at a more personalized approach. Our heart panel is 27 different markers, and one is a marker called TMAO, which is reflectively directly of the inflammation in the gut. Again, fire in the gut, fire in the heart. We also know that women are more predisposed to autoimmune disease, 12 times more likely than men to get autoimmune disease. And if a woman has autoimmune disease, she's 10 times more likely to have a heart attack. So the inflammation fire of an autoimmune illness can drive the fire of a heart attack and or stroke, and most likely dementia or Alzheimer's as well.
The reality is that we can learn from these people. We can recognize that the heart disease rates we think are normal in the modern United States and the modern world are completely optional. It might be typical, but it's optional. And I want us to get that truth out there and to recognize that we've got hospitals that literally have McDonald's in them. We've got doctors who are telling their patients what they eat doesn't matter. My own aunt went in for bladder cancer surgery this last year. We didn't know if she'd live. Not once did any of our oncologists ever mention the connection between food and health. And we know for a fact that, 90% of cancer cases are caused not by genetics, not by bad luck, but by lifestyle, environment, and food.
The cure is really prevention. First, you need to get the data to identify it. I call it my trifecta, and this is what I learned from Dr. Ornish. One is you got to do the right blood tests. And I'm shocked how many people come to see me and have never heard of these advanced markers. You can look at your cholesterol and break it out called a fractionated cholesterol. There's also specific inflammation markers that are geared to the lining of the heart to tell you, #1, who has a plaque, and #2, who has one that's most likely to rupture. We can now predict the ability of someone to have a heart attack 6 months before they actually have the event. So by looking at the right blood testing, for men, we like to do a calcium score, which looks at calcium deposition in the heart. For women, we like to do a carotid intima media thickness test, which is a specialized ultrasound. Again, we don't like to use radiation for women, particularly in the chest. So it's an ultrasound test for women of the carotid artery in their neck. It's a calcium score for the arteries of the heart. The third thing is looking at the actual endothelium, or the lining of the heart. We were taught in medical school that the largest organ in the body is the skin. Most doctors still think that. They're wrong. It's this endothelial lining. It's this lining of the blood vessels that has its own immune system and most likely its own microbiome that talks to the microbiome of the gut. If you've got leaky gut, you've got leaky heart. Those type of inflammations that we see in the gut, we see in the heart vessels, and you can identify them.
The microbiome, the scaffolding of the body, it's not just the scaffolding, it educates, it maintains the immune system. Believe it or not, if you have an immune disorder, any inflammatory disorder, an autoimmune disorder, the root is a problem in the microbiome. It's lost its power. The scaffolding is weak. So what's amazing about heart disease, it's not just cholesterol. That's small component. It's the inflammation that precedes it, whether it's different lipids that are oxidized because of inflammation, the immune system is so-called out of whack, is imbalanced, or how an overactivated immune system could cause damage to the vessel wall, or even how an altered microbiome is, well, the primary cause is that the microbiome is imbalanced, which leads to an imbalance in the immune system, which then leads to cardiovascular disorders. Not just that the vessels get damaged and their ability to heal is compromised, but the heart itself is more susceptible to arrhythmias, irregular rhythms of the heart.
I really feel, particularly for women, that a heart attack and a stroke should be obsolete. We should be able to identify the canaries in the coal mines. Who are the people who are really at risk? And by empowering patients, particularly the women that are at risk, by coming to conferences. I'm a teacher. I've taught 20,000 doctors in the last 4 years. By teaching doctors this, they can then teach their patients. And really what a doctor is an educator. My job is to have you come see me and let me provide you with information to empower you with knowledge, to help you make smart health decisions based on your belief system. Then we work as a team to get you to better every year.
If you look deeper into the literature about what really causes arrhythmias, irregular rhythms, well, one, of course, is the blockage of the arteries. And now we just said, well, a major contributing factor is inflammation, is the microbiome is the preceding problem, that it's lost its power or losing its ability to heal to some degree. And it all leads to inflammation, free radicals, which is unstable compounds that an inflamed immune system will cause to try to, get rid of outside foreign compounds and foreign bacteria that don't belong in our ecosystem. It's now causing damage to our own cells.
Well, the data is coming very, very clear. Besides my personal experience seeing women misdiagnosed, for a man that has chest pain, it's the classic elephant standing on the chest. That's very rare to see a woman when she comes in. She could be anxious, she could be nauseous, she could be vomiting, she could have abdominal pain like a gallbladder, she could have back pain. Women present with heart disease different than men do. Women respond to the therapies different than men do, and the evaluation tools we have for heart disease are not very good for women. So we're doing a huge disservice to the women in our society about how we can take care of them and prevent this number one killer of women.
Arrhythmias are due to inflammation and free radicals. Now, let's heal the microbiome. Now, the free radicals and the inflammatory response begins to calm down. And I've seen this time in and time out, time again, that when you treat the microbiome through microbiome medicine, those irregular rhythms get better. And who wouldn't want to see their irregular rhythms get better without the use of medicines that could be dangerous in themselves. That doesn't mean everyone will get off of them, and I'm certainly not making that recommendation, but microbiome medicine will heal at the root. And I've seen so many patients, countless number of patients with cardiovascular disease that got significantly better because we healed the microbiome through microbiome medicine.
The beautiful part of what we're doing in this personalized approach, the same therapies we do to support heart health, support brain health, support gut health, support skin health. So women will come in and do our reversing heart disease program, and they'll say, my knees don't hurt anymore, I'm sleeping better, my friends say my skin looks better, my hairstylist says my hair is coming in thicker. So they have all these other benefits of taking care of the bioterrain of the ecosystem, particularly the microbiome.
To think, good bacteria to help your beating heart. Inflammation, bacteria, and your gut. To see how it's all connected to your cardiovascular system is amazing. It used to be mostly men suffering from heart disease, but it's also a growing killer in women now. We've been looking at cholesterol and exercise, stress reduction, and statin drugs, but we're missing a key ingredient. There's a bacterial component to the lethal plaque that's been clogging our arteries. Here's a summary of our heart tips. Cardiovascular plaque has bacteria found in it. Certain mouth bacteria can create systemic inflammation in the body and are found in arterial plaque. These are foreign bacteria that don't belong in our ecosystem. So basically, if you've got a leaky gut, you're going to have a leaky heart. We've learned that women are more predisposed to autoimmune diseases, which often come from a leaky gut. And we've also learned that when inflammation goes down, arrhythmias start to heal. Again, inflammation starts in the gut. Heart disease is the leading cause of death in the United States, killing over 375,000 Americans a year. But maybe we don't have to suffer anymore. Perhaps you and I can protect our families by unlocking the healing secrets of this neglected, missing organ called the microbiome. So I urge you, click the button below and get the full copy of Interconnected series. Every single episode that you watch, you can rewatch at your own leisure, plus you get this collection of exclusive bonus resources. And for a limited time, you get the entire package at a massive 50% discount, but it's only during this live launch. You'll get lifetime access to everything you've seen here, plus the companion guides, the extended uncut interviews, and the How to Live Probiotically guide that helps you put this work into your house and into your family. You get the live series with the Q&A where I bring in the experts, you can ask them anything, and you also get to keep this at this discount during the live event. Don't delay. You want to harness the power of the microbiome, understand it so you can protect against heart disease and heal some of these chronic diseases. Guaranteed, this is the one video set you're going to want to own for life. Thanks for joining me here in the Interconnected series. Our next episode focuses on how doctors and scientists are sharing their new knowledge of the microbiome to help and serve the human race. We can't afford to wait 15 years for this information to hit Main Street. People are losing husbands, daughters, and friends. And the cost of waiting to get well is too high. Let's look at innovative new testing you can take at home and revolutionary treatments that are very promising. There's much more happening than your doctor may know of. If you want to be healthy and frankly survive in the modern world, you need to take charge of your health. And that means taking charge of the vital information that you need to share with your doctors. Again, I'm Dr. Pedram Shojai, and I will see you in the next episode.